Vivavo's CCM is about to self-assess its performance on eligibility requirement 4. Your role as a consultant will be to guide the CCM and facilitate discussions and use of the CCM self-assessment tool. Ensure the CCM members involved in the assessment understand the principles behind the eligibility requirement. Ask 2 volunteers to read out the principle and the full denomination of the eligibility requirement, taking turns.
Ensuring an inclusive and meaningful representation in CCM composition.
CCM eligibility requirement. The Global Fund requires all CCMs to show evidence of membership of people that are both living with and representing people living with HIV, and of people affected by and representing people affected by tuberculosis and malaria, as well as people from and representing key affected populations, based on epidemiological as well as human rights and gender considerations.
Promoting human rights and equality is not always an easy endeavor, particularly in a resource-constrained and unequal setting, since it challenges established power relations. In its SOGI strategy, the Global Fund acknowledges that work in this area is difficult and sometimes controversial in many parts of the world, and concludes that there is no one approach for every situation. As a facilitator, you will need to be culturally aware and sensitive, while at the same time promoting understanding and acceptance of a human rights and equality-based approach. Facilitate a discussion for CCM members to share their understanding of the eligibility requirement and learn about the Global Fund's commitment to human rights through its various strategic documents, the reasons as to why the involvement of people living with the diseases and key and affected populations is important in the Global Fund grants cycle, what role CCMs can play in ensuring the involvement of people living with the diseases and key and affected populations. Once the principles, the rationale, and the CCM's role in relation to the principles are understood, take the CCM members through the assessment process, ER by ER, MS by MS. Ask a volunteer to read out eligibility requirement G.
The CCM ensures adequate representation of key affected populations, taking into account the socio-epidemiology of the 3 diseases.
Then ask another volunteer to read out the indicator.
CCM membership of key affected and most at-risk populations may include representatives of injecting drug users, MSM, commercial sex workers, transgender, migrants, etc., either as representatives of organized groups and/or networks, or as individual representatives. In countries where these groups are criminalized, CCM has advocates instead of direct representation.
Ask a volunteer to read the examples of criteria for compliance assessment.
Non-compliant key affected populations that exist in country are not fully represented in the CCM. Intermediate compliance. The CCM is in process of electing representatives or renewing membership. Fully compliant. Key affected populations that exist in country are fully represented in the CCM.
Mark a pause and encourage CCM members to discuss and self-assess. Vivavo's CCM may submit its membership list to support its self-ascribed rating. Additional CCM documents may be submitted, such as meeting minutes, which show evidence of appointment of representatives of women and youth as key and affected populations. In Vivavo's case, the CCM may want to consider the inclusion of the National Network of Women's Organizations and of the National Network of Youth Associations, as evidence of full representation of key and affected populations that exist in the country. The CCM, therefore, may self-assess as fully compliant. Your role as a facilitator is to convince the CCM that there is room for improvement. By referring to the National Strategic Plan, you can argue that other key populations recognized by the National Strategic Plan are not included in the CCM, mainly sex workers, men who have sex with men, and injecting drug users. If the argument is raised about whether organized groups exist which can be contacted, you may refer to those CCM members which already have working relationships with SWs, MSM, and IDU groups. You may also offer indirect representation, i.e., representation of these key and affected populations by one or more organizations, as an option. At the end of the discussion, Vivavo's CCM should realize that its performance is at best indeterminate compliance. If it is committed to renewing membership, if not, non-compliance, since key and affected populations that exist in the country are not fully represented in the CCM. In this column, you may encourage the CCM to input information explaining the rating. For example, limited understanding of the full implications of the eligibility requirement, lack of information on sex workers, men who have sex with men, and injecting drug user groups, absence of organizations in a position to represent SW, MSM, and IDU groups, as well as corrective actions such as membership renewal, bearing in mind that the improvement plan will allow the CCM to capture all performance improvement measures. Ask a volunteer to read out Eligibility Requirement H.
The CCM ensures adequate representation of people living with the diseases, taking into account the socio-epidemiology of the three diseases.
Then ask another volunteer to read out the indicator.
People living with the disease include, for HIV, civil society members who represent organizations or networks of people living with HIV, or leaders of relevant communities if there are no organized people living with HIV groups. The number of representatives is determined depending on the disease burden in country. For TB and malaria, civil society members that represent organizations or networks of people living with TB or malaria, or leaders of relevant communities if there are no organized people living with TB or malaria groups. The number of representatives is determined depending on the disease burden in country.
Ask a volunteer to read the examples of criteria for compliance assessment.
Non-compliant. People living with the diseases are not fully represented in the CCM, considering the disease burden in country. Indeterminate compliance. CCM is in the process of electing representatives or renewing membership. Fully compliant. People living with the diseases are fully represented in the CCM, considering the disease burden in country.
Vivavo's CCM may submit its membership list to support its self-ascribed rating. Additional CCM documents such as meeting minutes showing evidence of appointment of representatives of people living with the diseases can be submitted. Vivavo's CCM is likely to assess its performance as fully compliant, given the fact that the CCM membership includes one representative of the National Network of People Living with HIV, one leading member of the former tuberculosis patients, and one international NGO involved in malaria programming. As a facilitator, you may start by acknowledging there is ground for the full compliant rating. However, given the wording of the indicator, you may encourage the CCM to reflect on the level of representation in relation to the burden of each disease in the country. CCM members should be led to ask themselves whether or not one representative of each disease is sufficient, and an international representative in the case of malaria, given the impact of HIV, tuberculosis, and malaria on Vivavu's population. At the end of the discussion, you may lead the CCM to accept to renew its membership and assign itself an indeterminate compliance rating. In this column, you may encourage the CCM to input information which explains the rating. For instance, representation of each of the 3 diseases, or acknowledgement of the need to increase the number of representatives, as well as corrective actions, such as membership renewal, to be included in the improvement plan. Ask a volunteer to read out minimum standard I.
The CCM has balanced representation of men and women. The Global Fund Gender Equality Strategy clarifies how women and girls are key affected groups in the context of the 3 diseases.
Then ask another volunteer to read out the indicator.
The CCM membership, both members and alternates, shows a balanced female representation.
Ask a volunteer to read the examples of criteria for compliance assessment.
Non-compliant. CCM female representation is less than 15%, or there is no designated representative with expertise in gender issues and no evidence of efforts to ensure an active voice for women's issues. Indeterminate compliance. CCM female representation is between 15 and 29%, or there is a clear evidence of efforts being made by the CCM to ensure an active voice for women through a designated female representative with expertise in gender issues who represents women's organizations and participates regularly in meetings. Fully compliant. CCM female membership is at least 30%.
Mark a pause and encourage CCM members to discuss and self-assess. Vivavu's CCM may include its membership list together with the report of the CCM reform process, which includes justification for increased representation of women. In Vivavu's case, 6 out of 40 CCM members are women, which is 15%. The CCM is likely to use this percentage to justify an indeterminate compliance rating, since it is above the less than 15% female representation indicator. Your role as a facilitator is to show to the CCM that 15% is actually on the borderline between a non-compliant and an indeterminate compliant rating, which indicates significant room for improvement. Also, it is critical that CCM members are led to understand the indicator does not simply measure the proportion of female CCM members. It aims above all at developing and sustaining a voice within the CCM and its various bodies, not just the General Assembly, which articulates gender issues from a woman's perspective. In this column, you may encourage the CCM to enter information which explains the rating, for example, limited awareness of the eligibility requirement or difficulty in recruiting female representatives, as well as corrective actions such as membership renewal to be included in the improvement plan.